Welcome to the deep dive. I want you to take a moment and picture monumental architecture. What comes to mind?
Usually pretty massive structures, right? Pyramids, grand temples.
Exactly. Often built by, powerful leaders needing huge labor forces and really signaling societies with clear, rigid hierarchies. Hold that image.
Because today we're going to look at something that kind of turns that image on its head.
Yeah, our deep dive takes us to an extraordinary archaeological site called Kaillachuro. It's high in the Peruvian Andes in the Titicaca Basin.
And this site, Kaillachuro, it really challenges some of those, let's say, standard assumptions about how and why monuments get built.
So our mission today is to unpack Kaillachuro. It was discovered, I believe, by Mark Aldenderfer back in 1995.
That's right. And what's so fascinating what the research suggests is this alternative way monumental architecture came about. It's not rooted in top-down power.
But in what then?
Well, it seems to be more about community, about memory and ritual specifically surrounding the dead.
And the timings here are just, well, they're pretty staggering. Radiocarbon dating has shown the mounds at Kaillachuro are the earliest evidence of monumental architecture in the whole Titicaca Basin.
Yeah, we're talking construction starting around 5,300 calendar years before present.
Which is, let me get this right, 1,500 years earlier than we previously thought monumental building existed there.
Exactly, 1,500 years. It just completely shifts the timeline for that region. It suggests, well, a very different kind of origin for complex building in the Andes.
So how did this happen? How did Kaillachuro, these 9 sort of low-lying mounds, how did they come to be? It wasn't some grand design from the start.
Not according to the evidence, no. It seems it grew organically over 2 millennia, actually.
2,000 years. Wow.
Yeah, roughly 5,300 to 3,000 before present. And it developed through, the researchers call it, ongoing acts of burial ritual and remembrance tied to the community's ancestors.
So it's like memory made physical bit by bit.
Precisely. A community-driven process built over time, not imposed by some authority.
Okay, let's trace that. Phase 1, the earliest bit, 5,300 to 5,000 BP. What does that look like on the ground?
It starts incredibly simply, just, basin burial pits cut into the earth.
Okay.
For instance, in Mound 4, they found a burial 2, which had just a single adult femur, a thigh bone.
That's it.
Well, that plus some associated items, things like lithic debitage.
Which is the waste from making stone tools, right?
Exactly, flakes and bits left over, plus a green shirt bead and a projectile point.
So quite modest beginnings.
Very modest. And these early burials, along with sand and clay used as fill, they started forming the first low mound. Mound 4 got to about 0.8 meters tall back then, so less than 3 feet.
Still, it's a start, a physical marker.
Definitely. And they also found shallow hearths nearby, which suggests some kind of early ceremonial activity happening around these graves. It's like the first steps in marking this place as special through remembering.
Okay, so moving forward in time, phase 2, that's 4,800 to 4,100 BP. Do things start to change?
They do, yeah. We see a clear evolution in how they handled burials. They start building stone masonry burial boxes.
Ah, so more structure now.
Right. There's a really interesting find in Mound 4, a small stone box, about a foot square, 0.3 by 0.3 meters.
Built how?
It had a prepared floor, even a double wall. And inside, fragments of a small human skull, the upper jawbone, and baby teeth from a subadult.
A child, then?
Seems so. And it was all covered in red soil and flakes of obsidian.
That sounds much more deliberate, more effort involved.
It really does. This shift to stone boxes, it shows a growing commitment maybe to making these memorials more permanent, more visible, giving memory a stronger anchor in the landscape.
And was activity still focused just on burials?
Not entirely. During this phase, we also see hearth activity at another mound, Mound 6. And in areas between the mounds, they found ashy layers, burned stones, ground stones for processing food perhaps, and interestingly, camelid bones.
Llamas, pacas.
Yeah. Which suggests, a wider range of activities happening across the site, not just funerary stuff.
Okay, so things are getting more complex. What about phase 3? That's 3,800, 3,500 BP.
Well, Mound 4 keeps growing. It reaches about 1.2 meters, nearly 4 feet high now, just through more activity, more fill being deposited over time.
And the burial.
They continue, and some are more complex pits. Like there's one called B7 that actually cut down through the earlier layers. It had human bone fragments, stone tools, and significantly, this is where we see the first pottery sherds show up.
Ah, pottery. That's a big technological marker usually.
It is. It signals maybe new practices, new materials being incorporated into these rituals of remembrance.
Then we get to phase 4, 3,500 to 3,000 BP. You said this involved some big transformations.
Absolutely. Mound 4 gets some major modifications. They built a semi-subterranean cyst.
Sort of a sunken stone chamber.
Exactly, about 2.6 by 1.3 feet across, made with local volcanic rock and some white limestone.
And what was inside?
A child burial. This one covered in red ochre. Later, this cyst was sealed up with these big, heavy granodiorite slabs and clay. And interestingly, that sealing layer contained remains from at least 3 other incomplete individuals.
So maybe becoming a more collective burial spot.
It certainly suggests something more elaborate, maybe communal, yeah. And meanwhile, over on Mound 6, something different happens.
That's it.
They build a rectangular stone platform. It had pretty thick stone walls, maybe only about 0.2 meters high, but 2 meters long. It looks like it might have been a focus point for ceremonies.
Like an altar, almost?
Possibly, yeah. And they found surface hearths nearby that contained bird bones, so definitely a ceremonial aspect developing there, too.
It really paints a picture of this evolving landscape of memory. So much care over centuries.
Yeah.
What happens after 3000 BP?
Well, around that time, the site seems to be largely abandoned, at least in terms of this continuous large-scale mound building and ritual activity.
And how big have the mounds gotten by then?
By that point, Mound 4 was at least 1.5 meters, about 5 feet high, and Mound 6 was even taller, at least 1.7 meters, maybe 5.6 feet. They become real features in the landscape, visible monuments.
But that wasn't quite the end of the story for Kaillachuro, was it? There's a later phase.
That's right, phase 5, much later, around 520 to 400 BP. This is well into the Inca period.
And what happened then?
Even after centuries of abandonment, people came back occasionally to bury their dead in these mounds. Specifically, they found intrusive Inca period burials in Mounds 1 and 6.
Wow. So even hundreds of years later, people recognize these mounds as important, sacred places.
It really seems that way. It speaks to this incredibly long-lasting reverence, this connection across different cultures and eras to these ancestral grounds, the memory endured.
So let's circle back to that initial image, the pyramids, the powerful rulers. Kaillachuro feels, well, completely different. How does it really serve as a counterexample?
Well, the standard archaeological view, as you said, links monumental architecture to things like centralized power, social inequality, elites controlling big labor forces, needing resource surpluses.
Basically, top-down organization.
Right. It's often seen as a display of that power.
And Kaillachuro just doesn't fit that mold.
Not really, no. The study proposes this alternative pathway, one that emphasizes community, ritual, and remembering the dead over those big societal power structures. It kind of flips the script.
So instead of power-driving construction.
Shared memory and collective ritual seem to be the driving forces here.
It's fascinating how that abstract idea, memory, literally took shape, became architecture.
It really is, the study puts it nicely. The memory of the dead didn't merely remain symbolic, but manifested as a materially visible architectural form.
Driven by what? Just the need to remember.
Sort of. By this, very human urge to return, reminisce, and mark a space as special around where ancestors are buried. It's the repetition of those acts, visiting, burying, maybe feasting, performing rituals that gradually built these mounds over generations. Memory upon memory.
And this was happening in a specific kind of society, right? These weren't farmers living in big villages yet.
No, that's key. This is happening among terminal archaic period groups. These were hunter-gatherers, largely egalitarian, meaning fairly equal social structures.
Okay.
And the researchers think this monumental construction starts right when these groups are showing the first signs of settling down more, maybe not full sedentism yet, but staying in places longer.
What else was going on with them?
Well, populations might have been coming together more, maybe some low-level food production starting up, exchange networks expanding, and significantly developing bow and arrow technology.
But
Crucially, this all seems to happen before they developed a full agricultural economy, before permanent villages, and before clear institutionalized social inequality set in.
So you don't need kings and vast surpluses to build something monumental.
Apparently not. At least not in this case. It challenges that whole model.
So if it wasn't leaders or economics driving this change, what was the catalyst? What pushed these societies towards more complexity?
The really profound idea here is that ritual itself, specifically rituals around the dead, might have been essential.
How so?
Well, these shared rituals could have acted as a powerful social glue. They helped create cohesion as populations grew or aggregated. Making the ancestors physically visible in the landscape through these mounds, it likely grounded the community, gave them a shared focus, maybe influenced how the living organized themselves.
It created a shared identity, perhaps.
Exactly, a shared history made tangible.
And it sounds like life at Kaillachuro wasn't just about ceremony. You mentioned other finds, like tools and animal bones.
Yes, that's another important point. They found thousands of stone tools, fragments of animal bones, camelid, bird mixed in throughout the site, not just in specific ritual contexts.
Suggesting what? Daily life happening right there.
It really suggests that, yeah, domestic activities, productive work like tool making or processing food, seem to have happened right alongside the funerary and ceremonial acts.
So the sacred and the everyday weren't strictly separated.
It seems they were quite intertwined. The site wasn't just a cemetery visited occasionally, it was likely an integral part of their living space, their social interactions. Life and death, ritual and work, all happening together.
So pulling it all together, the big takeaway from Kaillachuro seems to be that monumental architecture isn't always about power from the top down.
Right. It's not always about wealth or control. Sometimes it can be this incredibly deep, organic expression of a community, of shared memory, of ritual practice.
Built slowly, gradually, literally millennia, just through people coming back again and again to remember.
Yeah, it forces us to rethink what monumental even means and how early societies could organize themselves to create these lasting structures. It's not just what they built, but the why and the how that's so revealing here. It really challenges some long-held assumptions.
Okay, so here's something to leave you, our listener, with. If that simple, profound act of remembering ancestors, of performing rituals together, could literally shape the landscape and maybe even catalyze societal changes 5,000 years ago, what seemingly small, maybe everyday communal practices in our own lives today, the things we do together, the ways we remember, the places we hold special, might be subtly shaping our own future landscapes, our own social structures in ways we don't even recognize yet.
That's a fascinating thought to mull over. What are we building collectively without even realizing it?